Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Michelle Anderson. I spent 2 decades working in equine media, and I currently create content and help veterinarians and businesses connect with horse owners through my consulting business, Cadence Marketing and Media. I'm a trail rider, dressage rider, and an at-home horse keeper.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Clair of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and a pony club mom.
Claire and I collaborated for years when I was the editor of an equine publication, and she was one of our regular contributors. We'd finish work, but we always had more to talk about. New products, new research, and our own horses. This podcast is an extension of those conversations. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding and caring for their own horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. While I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode.
For years, about 200 horses and riders from around the world gathered together to represent their countries and compete against each other in the disciplines of show jumping, eventing, and dressage. In our last episode, we spoke to elite groom Max Corcoran and heard about the logistics of shipping the horses around the world and touched briefly on the logistics of getting the feed you need and the challenges of moving feed and equipment across international boundaries. Because of availability, cost, government regulations, it isn't always possible for riders to ship their own hay and feed with them, so often these are provided for them by the host nation. There's the issue, though, that the horses are coming from all over the world, the UK, the US, Japan, Australia, Brazil, and they all likely feed very different things. So how exactly do you coordinate getting feed for horses with such a diverse range of needs? To discuss this and much more, I have Dr. Joe Pagan with me. Dr. Pagan is the president and founder of Kentucky Equine Research, who have been the feed consultants for the past 6 Olympic Games. Joe, welcome to Scoop and Scale.
Nice to be here.
So, a lot of our listeners will probably be familiar with Kentucky Equine Research, but some of them may have never heard of Kentucky Equine Research. So we should probably start off by having you explain to everybody what KER is.
Okay. Kentucky Equine Research is, first of all, it's a private company that I founded now 35 years ago in 1988. And its founding is sort of interesting because just as you, Claire, my background was in academia. I have a PhD in equine nutrition. And I thought that you became a college professor when you got a PhD, which I thought that was sort of the job. As fate would have it, I ended up in the feed industry, the American feed industry, and went to work for a large American feed manufacturer. And it was a real eye-opening experience to me, so completely different from academia in a lot of different ways. But one of the things was I realized there was a massive disconnect between what was going on in the university and what was going on in the real world. So a couple of years down the line, I started KER as a company that would be research-based, but the whole purpose would be to do research that could be applied in the real world. And to do that, we had to have a vehicle for that application. It's one thing to do the research, but it does no one any good if people don't actually implement it.
Right.
So the idea was we began to work with a series of feed manufacturers, starting first with just a couple in the U.S. that has spread now to where we work with over 30 different feed companies on 6 continents. Wow. And our job with those feed manufacturers is to understand how people raise and feed horses in their country and then adopt and create products that are appropriate for those specific regions. So you mentioned it was actually the last 7 Olympics now.
Oh, wow.
That we've had this sort of strange relationship. And that began with the 1996 Atlanta Olympics. And it began accidentally because we had a company we worked with in Switzerland that asked, what are people going to do for feed at the Olympics in Atlanta? He was asking on behalf of the Swiss team. We said, we don't know. So we called the organizers, and they didn't really have a good idea. So we put together a proposal, raised our hands to become the feed and forage supplier for that. and we got the contract. So the first horse show we did was the Olympic Games. So that's a place to start.
Yeah, for sure.
That was an easy one for us because it was in Atlanta, Georgia.
Right.
It was reasonably close to Kentucky, where our main headquarters are. But if you'll recall, when the Olympics occurred in Atlanta, it was going to be in July, which is when Olympics typically occur. And when they planned the Olympic Games, the probably pretty low on their priority list is how the equestrian is going to fit into it. And it's going to be in a place that's selected, and it's going to be at a time of year that's selected. And so that actually, people were scared to death about that. The federations were very scared because they were worried about the heat and humidity. And what ended up happening, though, it turned out to be a good thing because there was this really big international effort from a lot of different universities to study the effect of heat and humidity on performance horses.
Yeah, so, I remember that.
Yeah, them trying to do that for the Olympics is what really moved that whole area of expertise forward tremendously. So that was a good thing to have happen. There were some innovations that came out, like misting fans and whatnot, and methods to measure how severe the weather was going to be to potentially modify the length of the course, the cross-country course, based on environmental conditions. So a lot of things good happened there.
Yeah.
So in terms of what we did, the organizers, the FEI, they stipulate that there has to be a feed supplier for the games.
Okay.
And that a feed supplier has to supply a certain amount of feeds and cereal grains and hay and bits and pieces here. But they describe that very generically. And as you start to contact the teams, what do the teams and riders naturally say? They say, we want to use what we use at home.
Right.
And who's going to blame them? That's
one of the rules of feeding, right? Is like, don't change something.
Well, that's one of the things that, and we embraced that very early. And we said, we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that you can have a feeding program that's as close as possible to what you're doing at home. So fortunately, jumping through a bunch of hoops for importation, most countries can bring their own feed.
Okay.
Now, it's not as simple as they just put it in a shipping container and it goes. They have to go through all of the quarantine regulations for whatever country it happens to be coming into. One of our big jobs has been to go to whatever that organization would be, whether it's the USDA or if the agricultural organization in Brazil or Australia or whatever, and say, okay, these guys are coming for a specific reason. They're only going to use this feed at the venue. Can we get it in there on a special set of regulations? And in most instances, the host country says yes. In others, they're a pain in the butt because they don't want to make a special set of recommendations.
Okay.
And so a lot of our effort is spent trying to talk to those organizations to convince them that this is okay to do.
Wow.
Brazil was a prime example. They've got very strict importation rules for agricultural products coming into Brazil, which is understandable. They don't want invasive species and whatnot. But to make them understand that it's going to be, the feeds are going to be kept in a very quarantined sort of area,
right,
is hard work. Now, fortunately, for all of the games, with the exception of Australia in 2000, the governmental agencies have said, okay, we'll let you have a special permit to bring these feeds in. And so a lot of the feeds get to be brought in beforehand. But I think right now is a good example. I don't think the U.S. has named their jumping team yet, have they? They've named dressage and eventing.
I haven't seen anything for show jumping, no. So,
how
does this work? Because, it takes months to figure this out.
Exactly. You're kind of getting close to the end. And so for those federations, they normally will fly the feed, and they'll fly it sometimes with the horses. Other federations will send their feed in advance in shipping containers, which makes it a lot easier. So the bulk of it will arrive via shipping containers. So the concentrate itself, I would say the vast majority of the horses will be eating what they eat at home. And that's the hardest part of organizing it. Forage is a completely different matter. And a lot of
like
times,
in Brazil, they don't have hays like we have.
Well, no, that's the problem is if you have competitions like in London in 2012 or this summer in Paris, getting the kind of quality hays that you need isn't as big a deal. If you're talking about in Brazil or Australia or even in Athens in Greece in 2004, there are no local hays. You don't have a choice for those hays. In Australia, you do, even though it's not what they would normally use. But Brazil's a good example. We had to bring hay in, and it was under a very special importation permit. And the Brazilian government was really concerned about weed seeds and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
And we were able to get hay that was certified weed-free, number one.
Yeah.
And we were able to get it in. But, talking about waking up at 3 a.m, worrying about things, we're shipping hay from the U.S., from the Pacific Northwest to Rio. And if something happens to those shipments, there's going to be 250 Olympic horses that have no hay to eat.
And people maybe don't realize, it's not uncommon for shipping containers to go overboard and things.
Well, and
it happens.
Yeah, and this has to go through Panama, the Panama Canal, and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So typically what you try to do is estimate the amount of forage that would be used at a games and ship that well in advance so that it's already there, it's waiting, and there's no worries. But if you were talking about our sport horses, how are they fed differently around the world? One of the big differences is the forage that they use.
Right.
So, American sport horses, we've got great hay in the U.S. It's plentiful, it's good quality. Pretty much everyone uses some type of hay, Timothy or orchard grass or something like that. In other parts of the world, in Europe, for instance, their hay quality is pretty mediocre. And I
always joke because I have clients who will complain about the quality of hay in their boarding facility here or whatever. And I always look at them and say, you have no idea. I have fed some really bad hay in my growing up,
So if you go to Europe, you see a lot of sport horses fed haylage.
Yes.
And haylage, they know how to make it. It's very high quality. And so a lot of the teams want to use just haylage for their horses. The British team, for instance, they bring massive amounts of their own horsage to the game so that they don't have to change. For the teams that want to use grass hay, we have typically defaulted to Timothy hay. Timothy hay from the Pacific Northwest for the last few Olympics. We use Anderson hay in Ellensburg, Washington, and we do that for a very specific reason. They grow excellent hay and it's very consistent, and the teams understand what they're going to get. Yeah. And so trying to have that. And then, for instance, for Tokyo, we ended up shipping 1,200 bales of that hay to Europe in advance of the Olympics for the horses to transition so that when they flew to Tokyo, they weren't on a new hay. So that was kind of one of the logistical hoops that you have to jump through. Fortunately, Paris, the vast majority of the horses that are competing at the Olympics are already in Europe. They may not be European countries, but they've already been there competing, training, or competing. And so they're on feeds that are available in Europe. So that England or France the World Equestrian Games in Aachen or whatever are pretty straightforward. It's when you start to go to odd places. If you go to Athens, and again, they did not have very much local support kind of stuff, or certainly Rio, or even Australia, because their importation is so strict. that if you take feed into Australia, it has to be irradiated. And
Wow.
irradiation, particularly of textured feeds, causes the taste to change, and it's bad. So that was a game where we actually tried to mimic many of the feeds that were made elsewhere because they couldn't actually bring them with them. But believe me, the thing that everybody wants, including us, is for them to have the feed that they feed at home.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you've got your horse to the peak of his career, right? Probably the biggest competition he'll ever do in his life. And then the thought of we'll just totally change his diet.
The last thing they want to worry about is the feed. I mean,
Absolutely.
That's the very last thing they want to have go wrong. And knock on wood, that has not been a big issue at most of the Olympics. What's a bigger issue is water. A lot of the horses don't want to drink the local water. And even in Tokyo, they were having our guy go out to 7-Elevens and buy liters of bottled water to bring back into the venue to feed to water their horses. Some of the same thing happened in Rio, where they would buy bottled water because they didn't like the water that was in the stable, even though they had a pretty elaborate filtration systems and that sort of stuff on it. It's, if you ship a horse that far and then it won't drink, then you're really concerned. So
that's not good.
That's a bigger issue. And so in providing the forages, number one is do something where they won't colic. That's, the number one. Number two is do something, get forage that they'll eat, because that's the other thing that causes great anxiety is if your horse won't eat when it arrives somewhere. Now in Atlanta, because everyone was so worried about the heat and humidity, most of the countries came over as much as 45 days early. And they rented farms all over Georgia where they would come and try to acclimatize to the heat and humidity. Yeah. And so they were in country for over a month before the games actually began. But that created a massive logistics deal because you had to do deliveries to all these stables that are scattered around in Aiken, South Carolina. So,
were you involved in doing that then as well? You became that. Oh, wow.
Yes.
I mean, you didn't think that was going to happen when you started KER?
Well, no. And I say, how do you define a hobby? It's something you don't make any money from. And that's how I would define the Olympics for us.
Right.
Is that we, always rationalize, it's a great networking opportunity.
Well, there is that, and especially
it's
with
also a great way to get your hair to turn gray too. But
oh yeah, absolutely. So I seem to recall there have been some times that you've been in barns at the games and seen some fun things. And was it Sydney when you first encountered the carrots?
Yeah, I think Sydney was the first time. And one of the things that they expected from the folks providing the forage and bedding and that sort of stuff was to provide carrots. And so we thought, we'll go above and beyond, and we found a good carrot supplier. What we didn't realize was how many carrots they feed. Yeah. And I mean, you got to think they're at the Olympics. There's a groom that has one horse, and that's all they're doing is looking after that horse. And one of the things they like to do is stuff carrots in their mouth. And so we ended up, the amount of carrots that were distributed, if you divided the total amount by the total number of horses, it was like 2 kilos of carrots per horse per day.
Oh, wow.
So the massive amounts of carrots. And so they thought that was fantastic. But unfortunately, it set this precedent that we had to provide carrots everywhere we would go. And so like the next one in Athens, finding a carrot merchant that has, access to that many carrots. We found a guy from the racetrack that didn't speak English, and we'd do this carrot exchange outside the gate and pay him.
I think I saw a picture.
Yeah, him getting euros, and we'd get our carrots and go back in. The other thing is carrots are massively perishable. Yeah. If you don't get the numbers just right, they go off pretty quickly. So trying to keep that going. So after each time we had to find the carrot guy in Hong Kong in 2008, this is no kidding. His name was Roger Rabbit. And these great New Zealand carrots. So in London, I went and bought, and since you're English, you'll appreciate this. I went to Sainsbury's, the grocery store, and bought the carrots for them. So I would go in. My job was to get the carrots every day. So I would go to Sainsbury's and get a truckload of carrots to take back into the venue. And so I was like one of their best frequent shoppers for that summer.
Oh, that's funny.
Carrot purchases that we made.
Meanwhile, there are families across the borough of London wondering why they can't get any carrots for dinner.
Yeah, we kind of bought out the carrot supply for Greenwich.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so that was fun. But it's surprising how many carrots a horse can eat.
Yeah, did you look at that at all? From a nutrition
I did. I went back. When we first did that in Australia, I did a microstate analysis of what the heck is this? And actually, there's not a whole lot of nutrition in 2 kilos of carrots if you look at it.
It's a lot of water, right?
Yeah, a lot of water. And if you calculated the vitamin A equivalents, there's quite a bit of vitamin A from carotene, but there's not much else. So
no. Yeah. So for people listening, KER has a sort of ration software program called MicroSteed. And that's like a lot of your company partners have that on their website that people can use. I've seen that sometimes, right? And so there are versions of that sort of available to people through the feed partners to help them figure out which of a feed company's feeds might be the best one for their horse, I seem to recall.
Correct.
So do you see a difference between the different, I mean, you look at we kind of mentioned that certainly from around the world, people are feeding their horses differently. And when you have all those horses in one place and you really get to see, okay, how do dressage people feed their horses versus show jumpers versus eventers? Do you see differences there?
We've done that analysis, and besides the Olympics, we ended up doing the feed for the World Equestrian Games when they were in Kentucky in 2010 and in Tryon in 2018. And did the same thing, except the Olympics on steroids, because you have 8 disciplines and there's like over 700 horses that are there. And I think we imported about 150 different feeds for the Olympics. And being the feed people we are, we analyzed all the feeds. So we've got a great database of the composition of all of the different feeds. And we looked at how different disciplines fed and how much carbohydrate and fat and whatnot was in the different disciplines. And there are some differences in terms of, and they're sort of expected. I think from WEG, one of the unexpected things was reining, which is no longer in WEG, but they fed a high carbohydrate diet that was kind of leaning more towards what a racehorse would be fed, where at the other end, eventing and endurance probably fed. Well, eventing was sort of in the middle, and dressage and endurance were on the other end, but it's what you would typically guess that they would be doing in terms of concentration of carbohydrate and the amount of fat that was being fed. But there weren't as big a differences as I thought there might be. Now, we only had what feeds they were feeding. We didn't have the levels of intake of the feeds from each of the disciplines, so it's kind of hard to say how they were doing that. But I mean, in general, if it's a European nation or it's a horse that's in Europe, they're probably using a similar feed almost regardless of discipline. There's some popular feeds that they kind of all use. Now, they may mix and match them a little differently. The big difference probably, again, is in forage choice. And I mean, typically, Europeans, again, may feed more haylage than North American feeds. In South America, there's probably a little more alfalfa fed. And also even from Australia, maybe a little more alfalfa and more chaff.
Yeah.
There's much more of a tradition of feeding chaff as one of your primary forages compared to, in the U.S. where that would be almost unheard of.
Yeah, I remember when some of the European feeds first came over to the U.S. and, everyone was just sort of baffled by there being chaff in the feed, which, I grew up, when I grew up, everything got a double handful of chaff, right? You fed your concentrates and you put a double handful of chaff in the bucket. So chaff was not unusual to me, but it was fascinating kind of seeing people's reactions here to the European feed with chaff in them.
Chaffs are something that are different here. And until very recently, mashes were something that you would rarely see in the U.S. And in the U.S., if you ask an American what is a mash, they would think a bran mash.
Right.
And they would think that it's kind of a high fiber, low carbohydrate deal. There are a lot of mashes in Europe and have been for a long time, but they're actually quite high in carbohydrate. They're high starch mashes. And at the World Equestrian Games, the most popular feed across the board was a mash. So all of these competitors were using, and there's 2 mashes made by separate companies in the Netherlands that were sort of the top 2 that they use. But most of the competitors were using it as a supplemental top dress type thing.
Right.
It wasn't the sole feed that was being used. But since that time, there's 3 or 4 American companies now that have mashes. So it's something that's starting to get a little bit of traction here. But there's probably, 40 or 50 mashes across Europe.
Oh, wow. It is interesting. I mean, I run into, like, when I've worked with some of the high performance clients I have that go to Europe, especially the eventers, historically, it's starting to change now, but it's struggled a little bit. Like, if they can't take their feed and they're doing, sort of the high fat, high fiber approach to feeding that's very popular in the sort of the eventing, American performance nutrition space, they go to, say, the UK for, I don't know, Blen and Burley, badminton or whatever. They're going over for maybe 6 weeks beforehand to prepare to train with somebody, not taking their feed with them. And it's tricky finding those high fat, high fiber feeds in the UK. They don't have those as much. They don't have, it's been, that's a kind of a much more leaning still towards the starch side of things a little more. And, you're not going to find things that are like 13% fat as easily.
The real high fat and fiber feeds are definitely an American invention. And we did an evaluation of how the feeds had changed from the 2010 WEG to 2018.
Oh, interesting.
And what we saw was there was a little bit of a migration towards higher fat and lower carbohydrate. But when you compared it to the American feeds, it wasn't anywhere close. So the composition of typical sport horse feeds in Europe still is in that 20 to 30% non-structural carbohydrate range, where, in America, people would think that that's crazy high.
Right. Yeah.
And, one of the areas that we've been studying, which you're familiar with, is MFM, is a myopathy that seems specific to warm bloods. And one of the things we actually recommend is to go on to a European type feed, which translates to sort of a moderate fat, a little higher carbohydrate. And, they're kind of hard to find here because so many of the feeds have gone to like super low carbohydrate and super high fat. I think we're going to see the pendulum kind of swing back on that, though. My prediction is I think we've probably overdone the fat and fiber thing here, and that we probably need to at least moderate the fat or balance the fats and probably look at a little higher carbohydrate. But I would say, if you looked across the board and said, why do Olympic dressage or Olympic show jumpers or eventers, they're going to be a lot higher in carbohydrate than what would typically be fed in America, because all of the European feeds they have to choose from are higher than we have in America.
Yeah, it's sort of like a chicken and egg situation. Right?
Yeah, whether, what's right and wrong, but the fact remains that the people that are winning most of the medals are
fair point.
Eating those types of
maybe we should take a look at that, because I think you have a fair point. I mean, I struggle, working with, horse owners. Starch has really become a dirty word in the United States, it seems like. And we've done such a good job of educating people, about that. This is a podcast topical of its own, but, how you feed horses with muscle myopathies. For such a long time, we only knew about, type 1 PSSM, and it was, high fat, low starch kind of thing. And so it's such a reversal now for people who have these horses with a myofibrillar myopathy to have that change of, they think it's a PSSM. Well, surely I have to feed high fat. And they struggle because beyond even the PSSM thing, just the weight of sort of equine nutrition consensus in the US is that we should feed less starch. And so it's hard to get people to, accept starch in their diets.
I think KER is a little bit to blame for this because we did some of the very early work on RER, the first myopathy really that was discovered pre-PSSM with Stephanie Valberg, who was at the University of Minnesota at the time. And we developed kind of really one of the first fat and fiber feeds, Relieve, which we still have today.
Yep.
But Relieve was developed specifically for horses that had a muscle myopathy. And one of the things we found, though, is that we couldn't really see big differences in what substrate they were utilizing, whether they were producing extra lactate. What it did is it made them calmer. And RER seems to be a myopathy that's triggered from anxiety. And so that was one of the, that might have been the mechanism of action to deal with this myopathy. But all the sport horse people jumped all over that. I was going to make the horse more calm.
Right.
And I think that's what sort of led the fat and fiber charge that we want something that's not going to make our horse hot. And I think, carbohydrate may have been a little over implicated in terms of being the culprit for some of the hotness. Some of it could be something as simple as you didn't train the horse, but our horse wasn't exercised enough.
People don't like to hear that though, Joe.
No, I know. But I think that everyone went in that direction, and then it became a little bit of an arms race of who could have the lowest carbohydrate feed or the highest fat. And I think that, again, there's probably some unintended consequences there because a lot of the work we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years has been looking at the effect of specific fatty acids in the feeds. And it's my impression, and I believe it's true, that we have way overdone the amount of linoleic acid in these high-fat feeds, the omega-6 short-chain fat, and that it's leading to some of the chronic inflammation and some of the insulin dysfunction that maybe we were trying to deal with by having a really high fat to begin with. So
I know it's
that picture becomes clearer. There may be sort of a rethinking of just, let's see how much fat we can get in the feed and how little carbohydrate we can put in the feed. So I think my prediction would be over the next 5 years, we're going to see a sort of a reversal back towards sort of moderate carbohydrate, moderate fat, fermentable fiber type concentrate.
Right. So you mentioned the MFM, the research you've done there, and that's kind of a nice kind of segue into chatting a little bit about, KER has a really interesting line of supplements that you've developed that when I look at them, to me, they're very targeted. Like, to me, they really, address a specific issue that somebody might be having. For example, you have one for the horses that have the myofibrillar myopathy. You have a very bioavailable form of vitamin E. Has some really interesting electrolytes too. I know we were just emailing back and forth recently about one because I have a client who was running a barrel horse on Lasix, and a lot of race horses run on Lasix, and maybe that's something you can explain to people. But you've developed an electrolyte specifically for those horses. So you're a really interesting selection of supplements that you've done research on them in your research herd or treadmill studies and the like to make sure they actually do what it is they're supposed to do.
Right. Well, a lot of the supplements we've created is to address a specific problem. That's how most of them happen. Or there's some technology that comes along that improves something that maybe you were already doing. So the vitamin E, for instance, vitamin E is not a new concept, but making a fat-soluble vitamin water dispersible and highly bioavailable is a different matter.
Right.
One of our biggest products is a product called Equisure, and it's an encapsulated sodium bicarbonate. And sodium bicarbonate's nothing new.
Right.
Getting it into the part of the digestive tract where it can actually serve as a buffer takes a specific type of encapsulation. And until that technology came along, we couldn't develop the product.
Right.
So as soon as we were introduced to that, then it was just a matter of trying to validate its efficacy in horses. The MFM one's a little different. I mentioned before that we developed Relieve with Dr. Valberg back at the University of Minnesota. I've had a 35-year working relationship with Stephanie. She was actually a graduate student when I did a postdoc in Sweden. So we've known each other for a long time. And she's the world's leading guru on all sorts of myopathies and has
She's
discovered
amazing.
a lot of them.
Yeah,
Polysaccharide storage myopathy she found. And we've been very fortunate because she has asked us to collaborate with her to look at nutritional solutions. And in most of these myopathies, there is a nutritional component, a pretty important one. And when MFM came along, the conventional wisdom that you should treat that just like you would one of the myopathies like polysaccharide storage myopathy, it turns out that that was really almost the completely opposite approach that you wanted to take for that problem. And instead, she discovered through some really eloquent work that there was a problem with the horse's ability to create glutathione in its muscle. And so we targeted more at how can we help the horse create glutathione so it has its own antioxidant. How can we supplement some other antioxidants? Because this myopathy causes muscle damage from oxidative stress, from free radicals. And how could we reduce the amount of oxidative stress? So it was because they had elucidated the mechanism of action that we could then try to create a nutritional solution. And that one actually works really well. And it's great when you get good feedback from folks that have problems and they try something, they come back and kind of enthusiastically say, oh yeah, that was great.
Well, that's I've worked with a number of MFM horses and it's devastating to people. I mean, they get, these horses really struggle and they've got often a lot of talent and very athletic and their owners are distraught. And often, unfortunately, with it being a somewhat new condition, what I find is that people have often, it's an odd condition because the horses, it's a weird, I wouldn't even call it a lameness, but it's hard to pin down and they spend a lot of money on veterinary diagnostics. They're often in thousands of dollars by the time they start looking at a muscle myopathy. So the owners are really, have been through a lot. Sure. And, they're looking at a horse that they had really high hopes of, fourth level dressage, meter 30 jumpers, advanced event horses or whatever. And they're just not able to compete the way they wanted them to. And so if you've got a product that can really help with that, it's a big deal.
The good news there is that Dr. Valberg is so well respected in the veterinary profession that when she came out and really educated the vets that this was a myopathy that probably was reasonably prevalent that you should look at, not as your very last thing, but you should kind of put into your mix of potential problems. And she has a biopsy that gives some definitive diagnosis. Then that really led to a lot of people, rather than waiting to this being the very last resort, to look at that earlier. And again, the response has been phenomenal. When you get a horse that has this specific type of biopsy and you follow these recommendations, they get better, which is, again, really heartening.
Yeah, I remember 10 years ago, they didn't. So it's a really big, we've come a long way in 10 years on these horses.
That's been a massive discovery, first of even the myopathy, and then being able to put together something that actually helps. So yeah, that was a win for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people are listening, if they want to check out the KER supplements, I think they're on the shopker.com website is where you find them. And there's a discount code that you can use. It'll get you a little bit of about 10% off, I think, CT001, if you want to check them out. But there's lots of good things, like electrolyte. I mean, again, I think the electrolyte, I refer people to that pretty often. It's that slow release electrolyte, even just for horses that don't have anything wrong with them. People always say to me, living in Arizona, what's a good electrolyte? Is there a good electrolyte? What would you recommend as an electrolyte? And that's one of the ones that I will point people to because it's interesting.
Those electrolytes are interesting because the one that you mentioned there is called Restore. The idea of creating that was pretty straightforward, is to understand, quantify how much of electrolytes are lost in sweat and then try to replace it. The thing where there was a little extra technology put in that was, again, using this similar encapsulation technology to make the electrolytes release more slowly so they don't get all absorbed at once and then lost immediately in the urine.
Right.
But we've got the other one that you talked about for horses that are taking Lasix or given Lasix or furosemide is an interesting story because you mentioned barrel racers, but it wasn't developed initially for barrel racers at all. It was developed for thoroughbred racehorses.
Right.
Because many thoroughbred racehorses are, when we developed it, almost all were given furosemide, which is a diuretic, before they raced and before they trained to try to reduce the incidence of exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, bleeding from the lungs. So we saw that, okay, there's a need, and horses that are given Lasix don't bounce back very well. That's the big knock on it, is it takes a long time for them to regain their body weight after they are given Lasix and then they compete. So we ask a pretty simple question right off the bat is, what electrolytes are lost when you give furosemide compared to sweat? And we did a bunch of studies to look at when we gave different doses of furosemide. We collected all of the urine and quantified how much of each electrolyte was lost. And we found that the ratio of electrolytes lost in urine was from furosemide was different than sweat. So we made a formula that would make both of the replacements and then tried to understand, why does a horse that lost a lot of fluid from getting a diuretic, why are they not thirsty? And that was part of the problem for why they didn't regain their weight. And we figured out that it was because of the nature of the electrolyte losses. It didn't stimulate them to drink. And so we developed a system so you gave electrolytes post-exercise, and that triggered the thirst centers to have the horse drink, and they repleted it. And so that, again, that was done for thoroughbred racehorses. And then I didn't even realize this. We discovered that barrel racers use a lot of Lasix. And they have a high incidence of EIPH, of bleeding from the lungs. But they use Lasix more frequently than racehorses do. And so this product has sort of morphed into the barrel racing industry, and it's probably more important for them than for racehorses, since they're getting repeated doses of it.
I know the first barrel racer I worked with that was, she mentioned she was on Lasix, and she just kind of casually said, so we give the horse Lasix when it runs. And I said, aren't your shows like 3 or 4 days long? And she said, yes. And I said, so are you giving it every time it runs, like every day? And she said, yes. And I sat here and I went, oh, golly, that's something we're going to have to figure out.
That was news to me. And fortunately, we had named the product Race Recovery, so it ended up being appropriately named for barrel racers too. That's great to have that. And for those horses, because that is, it takes, because I think you showed some really interesting research too, that it takes, as you said, bouncing back. But in those race horses, like days, right, to kind of get their mineral electrolyte balance back to where it's supposed to be. So for those barrel horses, especially if they're getting it day after day, like 3 or 4 days in a row, could be kind of a big deal. Yeah, it could.
So what's new and exciting? Like, what do we have to look forward to that KER is working on right now? I have a feeling that you really love your technology and kind of doing things with technology, like you've mentioned, and kind of bringing that in where it makes sense, and always doing that innovative applied research, which I always find really useful, being, out in the field and being applied. I always value that your work is always very useful and applicable.
Well, within the last few years, there's been an incredible increase in technology that you can use for research. Some of it has been in the lab with things like proteomics, all of the different omics, and looking at gene regulation and whatnot. And that's a lot of the stuff we did with Dr. Valberg, is because she had access to that. But on the other side, there's a lot of really cool wearables that you can use now for tracking horses' heart rate, biomechanical parameters during exercise, those sorts of things. And we're using a lot of that, but we've taken it one step further to understand how exercise affects heat stress and how you can recover from that. We've now taken the microchips that are used for identification in horses. These chips now come potentially some of the chips come with a thermometer in it so that you can measure the temperature of the microchip. And we've implanted those microchips in different muscle groups in these performance horses. So now we can see how specific bouts of exercise affect muscle temperature in different parts of the horse's body, and do it very easily because you just use a chip reader and look at it over time. And it's producing this fascinating information about how horses heat up and how they cool. And some of the work we're doing is looking at what are the implications of that heating up on things like intestinal integrity, and what are things that can be done to prevent that? What are the most appropriate cooling methods? So this has kind of opened up a whole new door of work that we can do in terms of heat stress. I've become very interested in, we've always been interested in what does the horse do when it's out performing, but we're interested in what's the horse do when it's standing in the stall at night.
We all wonder about that, right?
Yeah, that's been a real neglected area that we assume, well, we're just standing there munching hay, happy as clams. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And we know, for instance, in racehorses, that one of the big problems we have is gastric ulcers. Right. And a lot of those gastric ulcers are because the horses are exercised first thing in the morning, and they have a lot of gastric acid in their stomach that has not been buffered from hay intake overnight because they aren't eating all night. So we've got some new methodology to measure activity in stalls, chewing behavior, heart rate variability, these sorts of things that you can really get a good idea of what the horse is doing when it's not exercising as opposed to when it is. So that's kind of fun stuff that we're doing now. Our research program is pretty large. We've got 3 different research facilities, 2 in Ocala, Florida, and 1 in Versailles, Kentucky. But to run those facilities, we have a very large internship program. And we have 6 year-long interns. And these are all young ladies right now that have typically finished an undergraduate degree or are between the 3rd and 4th year of their undergraduate program. They come to us and they spend an entire year helping us do these research studies. And then they go on to grad school or vet school or into the feed industry. And so they're very enthusiastic about these new techniques and what we can do with those. And it's pretty exciting because we're getting results almost on a daily basis of new and different things that we had never been able to measure before.
That's brilliant. I've been sitting here thinking about, your comments about all the work that got done in Atlanta, on heat in horses. And I'm sure, I can imagine people doing that work thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if we could just somehow measure the internal temperature of their muscle tissue? And, of course, didn't have the technology back then. And then here you are, 30 years later or whatever, and we have the technology. So
yeah, it's amazing. I mean, we've got a set of 2-year-old thoroughbred racehorses in Ocala that are in training on a racetrack, and we get to measure their muscle temperatures when they come in from exercise and then see how cooling affects the muscle temperature. And before, when they did that back in the days for the Atlanta Olympics, they had to insert thermistors into the muscle that were tethered to machines where you could only do it on a treadmill, and it was quite invasive. And now we've got the horses running around the track making the measurement. So It's much more real world. Again, I mean, treadmill studies are great, but anybody that's worked with a treadmill, it's not the same as being animal, They get hot differently on a treadmill.
Exactly. You don't have the airflow the same. It's not the same.
Yeah. So this first time when we put it into the horses that are actually on the track, I mean, it's funny because now someone could say, well, if they go out and they do a 3 furlong breeze, what's their muscle temperature going to be? And I could tell them. And, 3 months ago, I would say your guess is as good as mine, that it's
right.
So that's how quickly you can learn things, is if you've got the right information. And the other thing that we're working on, which I think is going to be huge, is I mentioned these polyunsaturated fatty acids and how important they are. We've been studying them for a long time, but in order to study them, you had to take samples, handle the samples very carefully, ship them on dry ice. It was expensive to do the analysis. We're now working on a dried blood spot test so that we will be able to take a single drop of blood, put it on a card. That card can be sent in, and we'll do 24 different fatty acids from that one card. So it won't be long before we're going to be able to see the composition of fatty acids in real horses out in the real world and understand how all these different diets are affecting the composition. We've still got a lot of work to do to see what is the optimal ratio of these different fats, the absolute amount of fats. But it's kind of like the microchips. It's no longer going to be in the lab. We're going to be able to measure it with real horses. And our first goal is to measure 1,000 horses out in the real world and try to come up with some population statistics about what is the composition of fatty acids in a bunch of different disciplines in horses being fed different diets. Then look at, should we manipulate them or not?
Right. Well, that's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, so that's neat stuff too.
That'll be good because finally, maybe we'll actually end up with the correct answer to the ideal ratio of fatty acids. It's one of my pet peeves is when, you get sort of people selling products that say, this has the ideal ratio of fatty acids. And I always sit there and think, we don't actually know what that is though. We have an idea, but we don't really, we don't really know what that is,
the same thing. What I would tell you today is completely different than what I would have said 3 years ago. And we wouldn't have known that until we actually, went and did the studies. So that's one of the reasons you need to do the research. Yeah, it is a pet peeve of mine that in the kind of the lay literature that this whole idea of an omega-3 is an omega-3 and it doesn't matter where it comes from or what its chain link is or whatever couldn't be further from the truth, that there are serious differences between them, and the ratio of those fatty acids is really important. But if anybody tells you they know the correct ratio in a supplement, they're not telling the truth. Now, what we discovered, though, we have measured now what the ratio is in horses that have been on pasture, and it's very, very different than horses that have been on hay and grain. So, you can ask yourself, is that ratio on pasture the one we should be shooting for? But we have shown absolutely that when they're not on pasture, it's a very, very different story. But we can manipulate the fatty acids in horses that aren't on pasture to make some of these ratios quite similar to what they were on pasture. So
you're looking at cell membrane structure to figure that out, right? Red blood cell membrane, how those fatty acids get incorporated into those cell membranes.
Yeah. So really the reason that these fats are important is when they're incorporated into cell membranes. But actually the fatty acids that we're really concerned about are longer chain fats that aren't in the feeds anyway, in regular feed. They're in marine source fatty acids, or they're made by the horse themselves. But part of the problem with having the real high levels of some fatty acids is it inhibits the ability of the horse to make the other ones correctly. And so that's what we're trying to understand, is how we can correct those ratios.
Right. So for those people that are listening, we're talking about things like EPA and DHA. You might have seen those on labels for some fatty acid supplements, but many fatty acid supplements, you'll see EPA and DHA listed, and it'll be 50 milligrams of EPA or something, and it's very unlikely that's going to really do very much at all for your horse. I know that some of the work you've done at KER, where you have looked at that, we're talking gram quantities of these things.
Yeah, so we're trying to quantify how horses incorporate these fats at different levels of intake. And the most convenient cell membrane for us to measure is the red blood cell. But we have also started to look at the composition of the stomach, for instance, and what the fatty acid composition is there, which is obviously a lot more invasive to have to go in and take a bit of stomach to measure. So, we're hoping that we can correlate all of that back to this simple dried blood spot test where people can do it easily and get information about their horse.
Yeah. Well, I'm super excited to see what you figure out too about the heat stress in, gastric and intestinal health, because I think that's obviously living where I do in the desert where today I think it's 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat stress and, on the GI tract is something I think we don't think about very much as horse owners, but something that is a big deal. And certainly there are other swine producers and the like that are way more aware of heat stress and the issues it can have. And I think it has a lot of issues on our horses. And I think it's something we'll hopefully become more aware of with more work like the work that you're doing.
Right.
So that's very exciting. Well, as we wrap this up, I just thought I'd share too that KER has a really great, I guess it's a newsletter, online resource called Equine News. And I think it does come out in an email newsletter as well. But great resource if you have, questions about equine nutrition. Your library is substantial at this point. I think any question you could possibly have about equine nutrition, you probably have an article on it, or exercise physiology for that matter.
Well, a lot of times if someone asks me a question, the first place I go is into the Equinews library and do a search. and a lot of times I find the answer there. And
I've been known to do the same, I'll be honest.
that have been written. We have an outstanding group of technical writers that I think there's none better really in terms of producing that on a regular basis. And so, there's a newsletter that comes as well that you can sign up for free if you go to the website. But it is really, that's very high quality.
It's a very good resource. Yeah. And you really do. Your team does a great job of taking scientific literature and then rewriting it in a way that just the average person can understand. But I love the fact you always cite the actual research at the end. So if you're a bit more of a nerd or whatever, and you actually want to go read the paper or the actual abstract, the link is right there. So I think that's really nicely done. So that's kind of my last question as we wrap this up. I mean, based on all the work you've done over the years, if there was something simple horse owners could do, that would make their horses' lives better, whether it's, exercise physiology, nutrition, whatever, is there something that you just wish horse owners understood better or did a little differently that might help their horses?
Well, I think probably simplify what they're doing. I think a lot of times horse owners may overthink things. And I know that, and particularly with the advent of the internet and all of the stuff that's on the web, that a lot of times there's the temptation to try a little bit of everything. I would say, if I really wanted to feed a horse well, the first thing I would do is invest in some good forage. This is coming from a person who makes their living from feed and supplements. So that is an honest, heartfelt first recommendation, and make sure that you're feeding plenty of it. Most of the commercial horse feeds, and it's whether they're ones working with us or not, are well formulated and well fortified. The trick you've got to do is make sure you're feeding the correct amount of a feed to your horse. And you've got to do that by understanding what the horse's energy requirement is. The biggest mistake that's made in feeding horses is underfeeding a well-formulated feed. So you're not feeding the right amount. You need to understand if you're in that situation, there's a different class of feeds called balancers that will get the job done. And then, as you mentioned, a lot of the supplement stuff we do is very targeted. It's not necessarily something that needs to be done for every single horse that have specific needs. But again, don't overthink it. Just get a good feed and hay.
Right. No, absolutely. I say the exact same thing. I think that's always my number one thing too, is to read your feed labels. Make sure you're feeding the way the feed is designed to be fed, and look at your horse's condition and keep that in mind too. So that's great advice. Well, that's all we have time for, I think, today. But Joe, thank you again for joining us. It's been a pleasure. If you're listening to this conversation and it sparked any questions, please send them to info@scoopandscale.com. That's scoop and scale spelled out. You can find me, Dr. Clair, at clarityequine.com. For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Dr. Clair Tunis. Thanks for riding along with us.